as you may know, I've been working on creating this historical farm and people registry for the Center for Digital Humanities and Arts in Iceland. I need to move to be able to see something. Let's see. Oh, okay. The objective was to create a reliable historical farm registry, especially for the National Archives, and also to create a people registry in the way of creating an index of individuals named in the censuses and connect individuals between censuses. So instead of having only lists of each census, we would somehow be able to view this as a network of people, and the result would be to be able to see who lived on each farm throughout the span of the censuses, and also to track the lifespan of individuals named in them. The data we had to work from were existing farm registries and digital transcriptions of 16 censuses spanning from 1703 to 1920. Some of them were like full censuses of the Icelandic nation at each time, but we have a partial one from 1729 that only does like 3 or 4 districts of Iceland out of 10, and the one from 1870, which is damaged because parts of it were lost some time, and that one is missing most of northern and eastern Iceland, but is not fragmented in other areas. So what we had were almost a list of almost 1 million people living in just over 100,000 farms that had to be condensed down to probably 200,000 people living on 10,000 farms or so. And at first glance, this seemed to be quite easy to do, which was like not the case. But what we had were the lists, the censuses, and each census lists the farms within a parish in a systematic way, and within each farm we have a list of the people living there and the relation to the head of the household. Everything is done in relation to the head of the household, and if we have like external people, not relatives or like children and such, we have sometimes indications on how people subsist, what they do for work, how they live, and that's obviously because this is statistics for the Danish state. All of this is from the time period when Iceland was part of Denmark, and this was, of course, all done to aid in taxation, of course. But since we had all the farms listed by parishes, it was an obvious first step to use Björk Ingimundardóttir's 2-volume index of Icelandic parishes, published in 2019. She uses Jón Jónsson's farm registry from 1847 as like a baseline for her own registry, and then she adds to it and rectifies mistakes that Jón made by reading primary sources, the church registries and other public records. And we then used her version of the farm registry, I almost like mapped fully her text into a database. And then I got to work connecting the farms in this new registry to the farms named in the censuses. And then I faced the first problem, which was like the various name forms and sometimes different names for the farms between censuses. And that had to be normalized and standardized in, and that was like the first phase of cleaning the data and refining it. And that was all the refinement of the data, and all the cleaning was done in as non-destructive way as possible. So everything that needed to be changed was added on to the database's tables instead of changing the source data, of course. But then there popped up quite a lot of farms or homes in the censuses that were not named in the farm registries. And they were all placed like within the new registry according to how the census named it and where it was placed in the list. For the most part, those are small crofts or like seasonal dwelling places up on the heathlands for like the summer, where people were like tending to the sheep, and others down by the seaside for the fishing seasons, where people were fishing and those seem to have been, even though they were seasonal dwelling places, they seem to have been inhabited by people all year round. And often we can see that people lived there maybe for some. There were people living in those smaller huts for longer times. But since those buildings were mostly owned by the bigger farms, they were not named in the registries because the registry just mentions the farm proper, so to say. When it came to the data and the censuses, we faced few problems because those 16 censuses were transcribed in several separate phases. It was done by the National Archives in Iceland, and it was done under like different leadership, and it had, well, more or less the same motive, but you can see like different ideas reflected in how the transcriptions were done, because the data sets are of course similar, but still they are different because some of them are normalized and standardized to like modern Icelandic. Some of them were proofread, obviously, but others were not. And one of the biggest problems we had was that some of them were written in Danish. And quite often those making or collecting the data would write heavily abbreviated Danish versions of Icelandic names, and it was quite a headache to find out which names they were trying to butcher by moving them from Icelandic into Danish. So there was quite a lot of work put into cleaning up this data and refining it to a point that we had everything more or less normalized and standardized regarding spelling, and of course preserving the original spelling, and then creating a byproduct of having like a collection of name forms, or especially something that's really relevant for the farm registry, rather than for the person names. But we have all the data as it was written, except for the censuses that had been transcribed in a normalized way. Then, when we started trying to identify individuals within this huge list of names, the method developed was quite straightforward. We choose a starting point, an individual named in the census, and then we ask the database, please show me individuals from other censuses that have more or less the same name and more or less the same birth year. And we have some variation in the birth years, usually because the censuses may have been taken like in different parts of the year. So a year or two of the actual birth year is to be expected. This was often successful, especially with the unique names, but we have, of course, different name forms between the censuses. Some of the collectors or what should I say, registrant people, those making the registrations, they would often abbreviate or skip middle names, especially for children, and so they would not have like an obvious one-to-one connection between censuses when they only have their first name in one census, but then a full name, first name, middle name, and last name in another. But the greatest challenges we're facing are the most common names like Jón Jónsson and Guðrún Jónsdóttir. And you can see the numbers there, how many there are that have had those names. And especially in the latter part of the period that we're working with, like from 1900 to 1920, this is quite problematic as the proliferation of Jóns is enormous. What this methodology that I had been using, I described in some details, and now we have in collaboration with the Háskólinn í Reykjavík, the Reykjavík University, the artificial intelligence part of the computer science department there is in collaboration with us, and they have been trying to make an expert system, as it's called, or a rule-based system that mimics how I and my minions have been like connecting manually people together between the censuses. They came to the project quite late. They were supposed to come in almost 2 years ago, but they started now, well, in January, and they've been progressing quite nicely. And the system, they're working on 3 different approaches to utilize some kind of a rules-based expert system or artificial intelligence, just to have like a comparison of how different methods fare in working with data of this sort. And the system is supposed to parse the data and find all possible matches, and then present the most probable matches to some moderator, probably me, for me to then examine and confirm or reject. And by the confirmations or the rejections, we then refine the process of how the system is parsing the data and finding matches or possible matches. Of course, the method methodology has to be, well, it's not quite straightforward because, well, sometimes you can see that the same family is living on the same farm 5 years later in the next census. And then this is just like a straight line between people there. But then when as is quite often the case where families were split apart, especially the poorer ones, then the children might just go to some other farm willing to house them for the least amount of money usually. So it's easy to lose track of people when trying to track this, and I've seen quite a lot of instances of people disappearing for maybe 2 censuses and then pop up again. And sometimes I've found people that had not been registered in earlier censuses pop up maybe 30 years old or so. So there are some, well, the data sets are, let's say, fuzzy around the edges at least. But what we're in this phase that we're in now, we have the AI people trying to work out possibilities on the matching. But what we have currently is the infrastructure, or at least something approaching what we wanted to have, a research resource or infrastructure that presents open data with APIs to read from into other systems if needed. But we are now facing questions like, how would datasets like these be utilized in research? What is it what the researchers need, and what data do they need to have access to if they need to filter the data and maybe do some pre-processing on our end? So which kinds of processing should be available to them, if any? And how would researchers want the data to be prepared and exported from the system for them to use? We are in like this, let's say, the final phase of this first part of this project, I would say. So we have now done like a soft launch of a public-facing website for this that shows like a rudimentary idea of how the data will be presented to the public, with like first iteration of a search engine that's accessible on the website. And I'll show you like a glimpse of that by the end of this, and we are getting to the end of this. One obvious use for this resource is to use it as a hub or a resolver for all the institutions involved in the project, and make this an access point to various kinds of data that are kept in the institutions like the National Archives and the National Library. And I have here a list of, like, the National Archives. They want to utilize the farm registry to connect and interconnect all the documents they have on boundaries and meets for the farms, and all kinds of registrations and notarized records. And then they have a huge amount of hand-drawn maps of fields and pasture land on Icelandic farms. And then, of course, we have lists of estates of Icelanders who are named in the censuses but have not been connected to them properly. On the 100.is, which is run by the Árni Magnússon Institute and the National Library, we have 100 means manuscript. This is a portal to view images of manuscripts, and on that website we have names of the scribes, if known, who wrote the manuscripts, who have been the owners of the manuscripts, or if mentioned, who commissioned the writing of the manuscript, and then on the other end, who collected the manuscript and where they got them, and if, which is quite often the case, the name who was the last owner before it was collected, most often by Árni Magnússon. And then we have other projects like the Saga Map and Nafnið that are both parts of the Icelandic Árni Magnússon Institute, where we have a geotagged index of place names in the medieval Icelandic sagas and the contemporary sagas, and we've now expanded this into like travel logs of Europeans traveling to Iceland in the 19th century, mostly 18th and 19th century. And then the place name database that has records of the place name collecting effort that has been, it was like really strong in the beginning of the 20th century, and it houses quite a lot of like descriptions of farmlands with all the toponyms and place names either placed on a map or listed or explained in relation to other toponyms. And last on the list here is Ísmús, which is a database on folklore and music run by the Árni Magnússon and the National Library, which contains various kinds of folklore, as folk tales and folk poetry and folk songs and such, most often with named sources or performers along with information about where they were from, where they lived, and such. So there is quite a lot of data on what has up until now been on like on islands rather than being interconnected, and our hope is to be able to use this new infrastructure as a connecting, like a hub that connects all those data points together to create a coherent whole. And now I want to give you a brief look of the website. Here we have the front page showing us mostly just statistics on how far we've gotten in connecting people and places within each census, and we can go through this and view the data as it has been prepared in here. Here we have the list of all the districts throughout the Icelandic history. And if we choose a district, then we see each county within the district and all the parishes that have been within the district. And then when we click on the parish name, then we can see on a map here the farms within that parish, with like just outlines drawn just to see how the boundaries are, and then a list of all the farms that have been known to have been within this parish. When we have chosen a farm, we can see information about it, different name forms, and in which sources we have those names, the parish it has belonged to, and the counties. And then we have here information about what we can find about this farm on Ísmus. And here we have one Bjarni Arngrímsson, who was a source for something. Yeah, he was a source for those 5 sagas or folk tales. And we have information from nafnið. Here we can see we have here a list of information about it. We can see here a map of the farmland and some information about our toponyms and place names within. So we have gotten, well, at least the first step of the way towards making this somehow browsable and showing the connections to different data sets. This is the first iteration of a search engine for the data. Here we can choose first name, middle name, last name, and the status as written in each census. Sex, marriage status, unmarried, married, widowed, divorced, and for each of them we can choose how strictly we are searching. We can choose to search by individual censuses or in all of them, and if we want to filter it by age, we can do that here. And let's see, if we try Björnsson, which is probably the most stupid thing I could possibly do, because I'm taxing the database quite a lot because I've not throttled anything yet there. Yep, it's not going to happen. So if we look for the Jonathan, then we get a result list where we have the census, the name, the age, and his status. And here we can see that this one is like in some hybrid Icelandic Danish. And then the farm they lived on in that census, parish, county, district. If we view the individual, why is nothing happening? Is this just demotype this, because I'm showing this, nothing happened. I'm trying to open like the entry for the farm or the person, but I'm not getting any results. So I don't know, maybe you just need to take my word for it. The data is there. If you are interested, you can check it out yourself later on, maybe. But I think that's it for now from me. A description of the pains of cleaning data for a research resource or infrastructure.